thing that people told me again and again was in 2016 and 2020, people kept quiet that they were voting for Trump. They didn't fly their flags outside their houses on their lawns in Staten Island. This time around, people feel more proud to do so, more able to talk about it.
Just explain then, if you can, as much as you can, really, about how the kind of history of New York politically, not the full, like, the last 200 years, but kind of the last 10 years, 15 years or so. How has New York tended to vote, and what happened this time?
Well, New York, as you would assume, and as is the caricature, is very solidly blue. And it's metropolitan, and it has, as I said, the caricature of being liberal and more recently liberal elite. I mean, throughout this campaign, I have barely seen a single advert. I mean, they just do not spend money here. They don't need to, because the Democrats basically know that it's a safe seat for them and they will win. But what seemed to happen this time around was that Kamala Harris's lead was so much less than previous Democratic presidential candidates. So her lead was 11 points on Trump. Biden's was 23 points. Hillary's before that was 22 points. And Obama's was 28. So, I mean, she's really dropped back behind them. And I think in the last week, the Democrats have done some soul searching for lots of reasons. But when they look at New York, and the same has happened in California, both states had the biggest shift to the right in the US. And sure, they have the furthest to go, but that's quite worrying for them.
And was it the same thing that we've heard elsewhere, that people were bothered about their kind of personal economy, what the economy was doing for them or not doing for them?
So if you look at the maps of the states, where went blue and where went red, it almost exactly maps on to where the rich people are and then the suburbs. And so, yeah, it maps on more widely to the rest of the US, which is Kamala Harris did not do as well in those middle class suburban areas where she was meant to win big, and particularly win big among women. So you can see that in New York. So Manhattan is super blue still, as are parts of Brooklyn. But as you get further out into the suburbs, to Staten Island, to Rockaway, to Queens, you can really see a shift in sentiment where, and we went out and did some reporting, and what people said was, I do not have the same amount of money in my pocket this time around as I did 4 years ago, as I did 8 years ago. That's what I really care about.
And what did they say about Donald Trump specifically? And also, can you explain maybe the concept of these people who might actually be registered Democrat but didn't necessarily vote that way?
Right. So people kept talking about Dinos, which is Democrat in name only. So people who are, as you say, registered Democrat who voted Republican. And the thing that seems to have really changed, the thing that people told me again and again, was in 2016 and 2020, people kept quiet that they were voting for Trump. They didn't fly their flags outside their houses on their lawns in Staten Island. This time around, people feel more proud to do so, more able to talk about it. And I think that seems again to come down to his perceived economic record compared to Biden's. They can point to something and say, but look, he will make changes in our lives and he is promising to make clear changes in our lives, as opposed to the Democrats who kind of said, well, the future's going to be better. And that was about it. And that's kind of illegible, actually, to the person who wants to put food on the table. It's lovely for the people who live in enormous penthouses in Soho. It's nice for them to have their nice liberal values. They're not really the ones who were feeling the impact of that on their day-to-day lives.
And Trump himself, I mean, this probably didn't come into it at all. It never really does. But, obviously that's someone I would associate more with New York than I would Kamala Harris.
Totally. And he had a rally at Madison Square Garden a few weeks ago. And New York, a certain amount of New Yorkers saw that as a sign of loyalty and as a sign of pride in his city and him wanting to bring it back to the way that it was, because it has sort of there are various elements of it that have gone downhill, like the public services, and inflation and rent levels. So they saw that as him returning to his place and being proud of it. And Kamala Harris, but she didn't go back to California at all, I don't think. Maybe for some fundraisers, but she didn't do that same public act of returning to her hometown.
Finally, there's been quite a lot of discussion about how valuable it was for Donald Trump to go on lots of different podcasts, and I suppose we're talking maybe about, there's a whole range of them, but quite a few of them that talk to young men, which kind of maybe mobilize them. I think I'm right in saying that you listened to the Joe Rogan interview, all 3 hours of it. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, I did. It was a long one.
What was that like?
Well, the thing that I noticed differently to how Trump spoke on that compared to how Kamala Harris spoke on, I actually also listened to the Call Her Daddy podcast, and Trump assimilated, or was in fact, the tone of that interview. So it felt in many ways like an interview that Joe Rogan would do next week or the week after, but he was just the former president of the United States. Kamala Harris went on the Call Her Daddy podcast and was incredibly formal and answered the same questions as she answers on stage or in a CNN interview.
Yeah.
And I listened to the Harris one and I just thought it was such a waste, actually, for her to be able, what she should have spoken about was how she met her husband, whether she was an awkward teenager or not, all those questions that they talk about in that specific podcast. So I think the difference was this authenticity that the modern voter is so desperate for. Trump was able to do on the Joe Rogan podcast in a way that Kamala Harris didn't seem to be able to do on these non-legacy media platforms.
So interesting.
Days from now will be Liberation Day in America. It's going to be Liberation Day. On day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history to get the criminals out. I will rescue every city and town that has been invaded and conquered, and we will put these vicious and bloodthirsty criminals in jail. We're going to kick them the hell out of our country as fast as possible. And to expedite removals of Tren de Aragua and other savage gangs like MS-13, which is equally vicious, I will invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Think of that. That's how far back. That's when they had law and order. They had some tough ones. Think of it, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. You hear that, Mr. Speaker? Get ready. To target and dismantle every migrant criminal network operating on American soil. And there are lots of them. We don't have the same country anymore, you know that. And you know, when you look at the polls and they say about the economy and they have all these different things, the worst nightmare that we're facing is what they've done to us on our borders. We had the safest border in the world. In fact, there's a chart, which I hope they have, because I didn't tell them I wanted it, but there's a chart that I love very much because I wouldn't be here without it.